His grandfather had been a slave, bought on the steppe, trained as a soldier in the household of the Samanid rulers of Bukhara, and sold or transferred like any other item of military property. 2 generations later, his grandson commanded an empire stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Ganges Plain, held the formal recognition of the caliph in Baghdad, and maintained a court at a mountain town in what is now eastern Afghanistan, where the greatest Persian epic and some of the finest scientific work of the age were produced. The rise from military slavery to imperial power in 3 generations is one of the more remarkable trajectories in medieval history, and it happened in Central Asia. The system that made it possible needs explaining first, because it is unfamiliar and it shaped the entire region for centuries. The Samanid state that governed Transoxiana and Khorasan in the 10th century relied heavily on military slaves, known as gulams or mamluks, purchased or captured on the Turkic steppe. These were not agricultural laborers. They were bought young, trained intensively in horsemanship and weapons, converted to Islam, and advanced through a formal ladder of ranks with defined privileges at each stage. The best of them reached the highest commands in the state. The system produced disciplined cavalry of high quality, and it produced commanders whose loyalty was personal rather than institutional. Alptigin was one such commander. He had risen to the command of the Samanid Guard in Khorasan. In 961, he was on the losing side of a succession dispute at Bukhara, withdrew east with his own following, and in 962 took the fortress town of Ghazna in the mountains southeast of Kabul. He established himself there as an effectively independent ruler while still acknowledging Samanid overlordship. Power at Ghazna then passed through several hands until it reached Sabuktigin, who had himself been a slave in Alptigin's household and married his daughter. Sabuktigin ruled from 977, expanded the territory southward and eastward, and defeated a coalition of rulers in the region of the Kabul River Valley. He died in 997. His son, Mahmud, born in 971, took control after a brief conflict with a brother and ruled from 998 until his death in 1030. The timing was decisive. The Samanid state was collapsing. The Karakhanids were pressing on Transoxiana from the northeast and took Bukhara for good in 999. Mahmud moved to secure Khorasan for himself, and in arrangement with the Karakhanids set the Amudarya as the boundary between them. The Ghaznavids took the south, the Karakhanids the north. Mahmud then obtained formal recognition from the Abbasid caliph, which converted a successful commander into a legitimate sovereign. What followed was 3 decades of near-continuous campaigning, and the direction was overwhelmingly southeast. Mahmud conducted a long series of expeditions into northern India, traditionally numbered at 17. The pattern was consistent. He marched in the campaigning season, engaged the local rulers, took cities and their treasuries, and returned to Ghazna. Among the most consequential were the campaigns against the Hindu Shahi rulers of the northwest, whose defeat opened the routes into the Punjab plain, and the expedition of 1025 to 1026 against the temple complex at Somnath on the coast of Gujarat, which was the deepest of his penetrations into the subcontinent. The scale of the wealth extracted is documented in the chronicles, which describe enormous quantities of gold, silver, and precious stones carried back to Ghazna. Modern historians treat the specific figures with caution while accepting that the transfers were very large. That wealth funded the army, the court, and the construction program at the capital. The interpretation of these campaigns has been contested for 2 centuries, and the disagreement continues. 19th century writing, both British and Indian, tended to present them in primarily religious terms. Much subsequent scholarship has emphasized the economic motive, noting that the wealth of Indian temple treasuries was the principal target, that Mahmud also campaigned against Muslim rulers in Iran and Central Asia with comparable severity, and that Hindu commanders served in his army in senior positions. Both readings appear in the current literature, and the sources support elements of each. The Punjab was annexed and governed from Lahore, which became the Ghaznavid administrative center in India and remained under the dynasty's control long after its power elsewhere had collapsed. That annexation established a durable Muslim political presence in northern India, and the sultanates that followed built on it. Mahmud's campaigns in the other direction are less famous and were strategically important to him. He took Juarez in 1017, absorbing the province and bringing its scholars, including al-Biruni, back to his own court. He campaigned into western Iran, taking Rai in 1029. He fought the Karakhanids when the boundary arrangement broke down.
The court at Ghazna is the other half of the story, and it produced two things of permanent importance. The first is the Shahnameh. Firdausi, working in Khurasan, spent decades composing an enormous verse epic recounting the history and legends of the Persian kings from the beginning of the world to the Arab conquest. It runs to roughly 50,000 couplets. He completed it around 1010 and presented it to Mahmud. The story of the reward and of the poet's dissatisfaction with it is one of the most repeated anecdotes in Persian literary history, and historians treat the details as uncertain while accepting that the work was completed under Ghaznavid rule and dedicated to Mahmud. The Shahnameh became the central text of Persian literary culture and remains so. The second is the scientific work. Al-Birumri, brought from Khwarezm, spent the remainder of his career attached to the Ghaznavid court. The Indian campaigns gave him access to the subcontinent, where he learned Sanskrit, read Indian astronomical and mathematical texts in the original, and produced around 1030 his study of Indian religion, science, and custom. He also dedicated his major work of mathematical astronomy to Mahmud's son Masud. Several other scholars and poets were attached to the court, in some cases by compulsion rather than invitation, and the concentration of talent at Ghaznav in these decades was considerable. The capital itself was rebuilt on an imperial scale, with mosques, palaces, gardens, and a library. Excavations at the site have recovered marble panels, decorated brickwork, and inscriptions, and two decorated victory towers of the 11th and 12th centuries still stand. The army that carried out these campaigns is documented enough to be described. Its core was the standing corps of slave cavalry, professional, permanently on the payroll, and directly attached to the ruler rather than to any tribal or provincial authority. Around this corps were contingents of Turkic tribal horsemen, Afghan and Dailami infantry, volunteers who joined for a share of the proceeds, and a corps of war elephants acquired in India and thereafter used in Ghaznavid armies as a matter of course. Maintaining a standing professional force of this size in cash was extremely expensive, which is precisely why the campaigns could not stop. The administration was equally distinct from the army. The Ghaznavids inherited the Persian bureaucratic system that had developed under the Samanids and staffed it with Persian secretaries who ran the chancery, the treasury, and the provincial revenue offices in Persian. One of these officials, Abul Fazl Bayhaqi, spent his career in the Ghaznavid chancery and later wrote an enormous history of the dynasty. Only a portion survives, covering the reign of Mahmud's son Masud, and it is regarded as one of the finest works of historical prose in Persian, valuable precisely because its author was an insider, describing the daily operation of a court he served in. There is a further point about the language of government that is easy to miss. The rulers were Turkic in origin and spoke Turkic. The army was substantially Turkic. The administration, the literature, and the court culture were Persian. That combination, a Turkic military elite governing through Persian institutions and patronizing Persian letters, is not a Ghaznavid peculiarity, but the pattern that would define the region from the Bosphorus to Bengal for the next several centuries. The Shahnameh, the great celebration of the pre-Islamic Persian past, was completed for a Turkic sultan whose grandfather had been bought as a slave, and nobody at the time appears to have found that combination strange. The empire structure contained the weakness that eventually destroyed it. It was held together by the army. The army was paid from plunder and tribute, and the plunder required continuous campaigning. A state organized on that basis is stable only while it is expanding. Mahmud died in 1030. His son Masud Awal inherited an empire at its greatest extent and lost the western half of it within a decade. The Seljuk Turks, a rising confederation from the Central Asian steppe, defeated the Ghaznavid army decisively at Dandana Khan near Merv in 1040. Khorasan was gone. The Ghaznavids were pushed back into Afghanistan and the Punjab, where they survived as a regional power for another century and a half before being extinguished by a rival dynasty from Gur in the 1180s. The consequences of that single battle were enormous because the Seljuks did not stop at Khorasan. They took Iran, entered Baghdad in 105, and then moved into Anatolia, where their victory over the Byzantines at Manzikert in 1071 opened the region to Turkic settlement and set in motion the process that eventually produced the Ottoman state. What Mahmud left behind was not the empire, which lasted barely a decade past his death in its full form. It was a demonstration and a precedent that a Turkic military dynasty operating from Central Asia could govern the Persian-speaking world through Persian administrative institutions while ruling as legitimate Islamic sovereigns. Every major Central Asian and Indian dynasty for the following 7 centuries operated on some version of that model. History isn't just the past, it's the record of how the present came to be. Comment below with the ruler or period of Central Asian history you would like covered next. If this kind of documented, source-based history speaks to you, consider liking and subscribing so more of it can reach you. This video uses AI-generated audio and visuals for educational purposes only.